Welcome to Coding After Work stream. Before we start, we want to thank our sponsor, Progress Telerik. They have amazing Blazor UI components with actually over 85 components
That's 10
now.
more than last time.
It is. I checked just before we started the stream. And we will add a link to those controls in the chat.
Yeah, because chances are with 85 different components, whatever you need, they have.
Yep. And if you're seeing this on YouTube, please subscribe. And the belly thingy.
Belly
the alarm thingy.
I think it's called a bell.
Click the bell. Click the belly.
Don't click the belly.
That way you will get notifications whenever we go live. But now, let's bring in our guest.
Welcome, Ed Charbenau.
Hello, hello. How are you guys doing?
We are doing good. And just a quick note, we know you work for our sponsor, but that's not the reason why you are here. You are here because you are amazing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate
So
that.
our Progress
being
Teller.
amazing.
But there you go. So what do you do at Progress Teller?
So I am a developer advocate, and I have been working on Blazor for over 3 years, believe it or not. So I remember going to an MVP summit in Seattle, Washington, and seeing Steve Sanderson show off this interesting idea of running .NET in the browser. And I went back to Progress and said, we need to make some UI components for this now, because when this launches, it's going to be huge. And I think we've been on the right track so far.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And it has become huge.
It has. It has.
I get questions almost every day from people that going to start up or they already have something in production.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty popular. And I see a lot of potential with Maui and Blazor Hybrid and running shell type applications that have Blazor embedded in them, but they run on web, desktop, and mobile natively. And I think that's going to be really big. And if you're going to target those type of devices, you need to know how to write some responsive UI code.
Yes, please. And that's why you're here.
That is why I'm here. Hopefully I can steer some folks in the right direction. There's a lot of tools out there to do this. And if you look in the right places, you can get some pretty good techniques that you can use. And there's things like Bootstrap and Tailwind that we'll talk about. But fundamentally, all those things use CSS. And if you learn CSS and take a few minutes to understand some of those fundamentals, you can really, really make some nice applications.
Cool.
Nice.
So do you want me to bring in your screen?
Sure. Let's do this. So I brought some slides because why not?
Why not?
Like I was saying, we have Maui and Blazor Hybrid. And if you've looked at any of those things, they are, trying to come up with a solution to write once, run anywhere and everywhere. And if you think about that scenario, you have all sorts of different devices in every ecosystem imaginable, and they have different screen sizes. And I remember back in the day, we used to write code for about 960 pixels because we didn't know, exactly what our website was going to run on, but we probably knew it was going to be a desktop, and it was going to be one of the main, low resolution to HD type monitors, and that was about it. We used to have this CSS framework called 960GS. It stood for 960 grid system. And it was literally just locked into 960 pixels. You weren't flexible at all with that. But it was a nice, even number, good average of these resolutions that we had. So I'm assuming there's a lot of people that are migrating apps from this generation still. You've got your Silverlight apps, you've got your UWP and XAML and those type of apps. and they're running on the desktop, and businesses are focused on delivering quickly and getting their stuff kind of webified so it runs in the browser. And I think Blazor's a really good candidate for that. So it all comes down to knowing exactly what your users are using, and we don't quite have that luxury anymore to know that they're going to be on a desktop. So today more people use smartphones than anything else to browse the web and interact with these web applications. And these things are on like literally everything. I went to the big box store the other day, and there was a fridge with like this giant LG tablet like embedded into the door, and my
Yeah.
daughter's like, I need that to play Roblox. And I was like, why on God's green earth would you want to play Roblox on the refrigerator? And she's like,
Because
well,
you
if you
can.
ground me, you ground me and take away my phone, you can't really take away the fridge. And I was like, yeah,
Smart.
there's
That's some creative
Yeah.
thinking.
that's an interesting point of view.
Yeah.
So, we've got literally everything these days, and a lot of it's going to be tablets and phones, but we want to be flexible so we can run, where we think our customers are going to be at least. For some apps, a refrigerator might not cross your mind. It might be some of those things, one of those things you're like, oh yeah, somebody might actually do that. And then if you're inside of like a firewall or something, you're like, nah, nobody's ever going to use a fridge. But I at least need to watch out for, tablets and smartphones and that sort of thing. So we need to be responsive with the way we design our web applications. So this is all about creating a flexible layout, making sure the content is flexible, and using media queries, which I can talk a bit about. I'll get deeper into media queries, but media queries allow you to target devices with these screen size queries. So you can say, if the device can show this many pixels, then we'll go ahead and add more real estate to the layout and move some columns around and do that sort of thing. And they're extremely helpful. And this is basically the backbone of all of those popular frameworks that you hear about: Bootstrap, Tailwind, and Foundation, and all of those sort of things use a media query. And those media queries enable you to build these responsive websites and applications where things translate over to columns and different types of layouts as you get bigger and smaller with the real estate that you have.
And especially today, it's difficult because even if people are on a huge screen on their computer, you don't know if they're actually using the whole window. So you can't even be sure of that.
Yeah, so if you're in snap mode on Windows, for example,
Yeah.
that could be an opportunity for your application to adapt to being in snap mode and offer, condensed view. Maybe it's, an email application or something like that. And maybe you want to show like a list view when it's in that compact mode versus showing a preview of the email. That's just like a quick idea of what you could do with something like this. So I'm sure folks out there have heard about Bootstrap by now. It's pretty popular. I've heard this is a very popular thing. I've used Bootstrap myself. I've used Foundation. I've used quite a few of these things. And there's nothing wrong with any of these frameworks. And I'm going to talk about some more of them here in a second. They're great jumping off points. They're excellent to have as part of like that file new project experience, especially if you're getting acquainted with a new framework. You don't want to have to worry about laying out an application when it's, the Hello World style project. Maybe you're building a proof of concept. All those things are great reasons to use Bootstrap or the other very popular one, Tailwind. And I put this screenshot on here for a reason. This is a very well-designed tutorial by the Tailwind folks. And I think this one, I'm trying to remember exactly where I found it, but the tutorial is called Designing with Tailwind. And I believe it's trying to target designers a little bit more than developers, in the sense that it really shows you how to create a good design with Tailwind. And it's a really excellent tutorial. It's written with a lot of videos to accompany the material, and samples on GitHub that you can clone and walk through. The documentation is absolutely fantastic. One little caveat here, though, is this is tailored heavily towards Tailwind, although you could do this exact same thing just by knowing CSS. And I have a feeling that Tailwind, it abstracts a little bit too much. I haven't personally used it. The style in which it takes the CSS and adapts it to kind of put it in the context of HTML, it's really verbose. And I thought that was kind of strange until I started to read through it. And I can understand what's happening in here. And what they've done is they've created a domain-specific language. If you're not familiar with that term, it means that the tool, I don't know why my Zoom tool's acting weird, but the tool itself has its own language to it. And this is one of the faults I feel like Angular has. So you don't learn JavaScript when you do Angular. You learn Angular. And Tailwind feels the same way to me. You don't learn CSS when you build with Tailwind. You learn Tailwind. And when something new comes along, or there's new features added to the browser, then you get left behind because you know Tailwind and you don't know the thing that powers Tailwind. So they've taken things from CSS and basically embedded it here in the HTML. So you have this like small flex and small justify between. I understand what all these terms mean. They're one-for-one mappings to CSS. So if you just learned CSS, you probably wouldn't need half the stuff that's here. They're very handy tools, again, for prototyping. It's amazing. There's nothing wrong with using them. I'm not bashing anybody that uses them. I personally could see myself, creating a demo with this. If I wanted to create something very quickly, it's not a problem there. But as far as like learning technology goes, I would say if you're using Tailwind, pivot over to CSS and learn what some of these things are doing under the hood. You'll be a better developer for it. And that's what I hope to show here in some of my demos. And
could we just go back to the previous slide?
Absolutely.
One thing that rubs me the wrong way is that the BG, I'm assuming that's background, and then it says gray. So we are saying in the CSS what color it is. Isn't that kind of the thing
HTML? In the class name, it's saying gray.
So I'm thinking that the idea of CSS is to abstract those things and say, well, this is the background. What color the background is, that's changeable.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree there. Like I said, there's a lot in here that I personally wouldn't use too much of. It steps over some boundaries when you're talking about separation of concerns.
With that said, we are using Bootstrap
for
our blogs because for the very reason you mentioned, Ed, just to get it up and running. But I learned nothing doing that. I learned that I'm not a fan.
Yeah, so
because of the reasons you say.
I've got Bootstrap on my blog as well, and I recently went through the exercise of rewriting that theme in pure CSS. I haven't deployed it yet, but I do have it running locally, and it's a one-for-one copy, and the amount of code is a magnitude less than what it was when I was using Bootstrap.
I can imagine. I had no clue there was so much code involved that you're not using. It's such a waste. I think I had like 22,000 rows of code, which I might have needed maybe 20 rows,
perhaps
30. Yeah. So yeah, that's a lot of overhead.
Yeah, I see with Tailwind, a lot of people really like this. I think a lot of the attraction to it is, and I'll go back again for a second, is something like this. You see this beautiful website, and you're like,
Yeah.
I want to build that, so I'm going to use Tailwind. But the kind of misunderstanding here is it's not Tailwind that's making it look good. It's CSS that's making it look good, and a designer that is making it look good.
Yeah.
You can make,
And they have good tutorials. That's also a huge factor here, I think. If there
Yeah.
is available a really good tutorial, they win.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's has a lot to do with its success. Is the documentation is bar none. I mean, it's fantastic. I'm not, like I said, I'm not against them in any way for doing what they're doing. This is my personal preference, though. Is I see it doing exactly what's in the bullets here. Is it's wrapping existing CSS specs. So they're basically mapping things that happen in CSS already to what they put in their CSS classes, which gets a little bit weird with things like Jimmy pointed out with the background colors, and I pointed out with the Flexbox stuff. It's all things that you could have just spent a few seconds writing in CSS, and they're the same syntax, but they're being used in a different file, basically. So they've mapped this stuff out so you can just write it inline in HTML, which feels very much like inline styles, which still, in my opinion, are icky. That's the technical term. I promise you, if you take a computer science course, that is what it is called. It is definitely icky. And it lets you write more HTML and less CSS, which makes your HTML very verbose like this, which makes it hard for me to look for abstractions in here and make components out of these things, for example, because I've got so much going on in here. I start tacking on like some click events and all of that stuff. This header, this element is just going to grow and be so big that, I mean, this is a button. This is a button declaration down here. And you can see how verbose just this button is. And I think this is not Angular. This is a React example, I believe. It's either React or Vue. They've got samples in every JavaScript framework available. So I just grabbed one real quick, and it's like, here you've got a click event, and it's a type button, and then you've got this class that goes on for days just to declare a button. It's just a button. Now, come on. It should say button class is foo, and that's it. That it shouldn't have all of this in it. So I'll get off my little bit of a soapbox here. And again, I can't stress enough. Tailwind is great. Use it to prototype and use it as a bridge to learning CSS, but don't use it as a supplement for learning CSS. It's gonna bite you in the long run, I promise.
That makes sense.
So let's talk a little bit about what's available and absolutely easy to use, and that's CSS Grid. So this is a layout-based system that is built into CSS now that wasn't here a few years ago. So if you've tried CSS in the past and you're like, oh, it was hard, just I had to float things and I didn't understand this whole float model thing, that's gone. It's not gone, but it's deprecated, for lack of a better term. There are newer, better ways to do this now, and CSS Grid is one of those things. And I want to stress here that this is a two-dimensional based grid layout system, because I'm going to show you another one in a minute that works a little bit differently, called Flexbox. So this is pretty much the type of grid that you would want to use if you were going to do Bootstrap. It has its own syntax in Bootstrap, though, and you define a grid and you place your elements within that grid. CSS Grid works the same way now. So I'll show you how to define one of these in a few minutes in some code, but I just want to give you a quick visual of how this works. You could create a real easy 3-column grid. Those items line up into that grid in those columns. And then you can also define how you want those rows displayed. And again, the elements within this container will line up in these rows. And it's important to mention here, again, that it is a two-dimensional grid system. So if you want a layout where everything lines up perfectly in these columns and in these rows, and you care deeply about these elements fitting this column and having the same spacing and starting and ending on the same plane here, this is for you. This is CSS Grid, and it is not exclusive. You can use it with this other layout system, Flexbox, that I'm about to show next. So with Flexbox, you have a one-directional layout system, and this is a flow type of a system. So when the elements hit the end of the container, they will wrap onto the next available space in that container. And we can also go vertically with this. So we can do horizontal and vertical Flexbox layouts. So this is really nice for different reasons. You can imagine maybe a sidebar here with some navigation and the elements go down that sidebar, or maybe you have something like a tag cloud. You don't really care how the words line up in that tag cloud, just that they wrap and they flow from left to right. So this is an excellent choice for very many things, and it can be used in conjunction with CSS Grid. Now, if you, again, care deeply about these things lining up, then you want CSS Grid and not Flexbox. So if you find yourself frustrated with Flexbox because your elements don't line up vertically, then you're using the wrong layout. Flexbox is very good at flowing things, but it is not there to line up things. You can force it to make things line up, and then you get like these, I think they call them orphan elements. So you can imagine this last element, we get all of these three to line up properly. This one will orphan, and it will either drop in some weird location or fall in the middle somewhere, and it will aggravate you, especially if you have a little bit of attention to detail in your system. Like you're going to be frustrated at where this thing goes, or it will do some weird thing like just stretch the entire bottom here. It never is going to behave the way you want it to. You're using the wrong thing. Go back to CSS Grid and try it with that. So that's
This
just
sounds like first-hand experience.
Yes. Yes, I did this on one of my shows one day, and I was like, I cannot get these things to line up. And then I was like, why? I had something like probably about 30 lines of CSS, and I'm like, well, why am I not using Grid again? And I couldn't remember why, and I went back and used Grid, and like in 3 lines of code, I had the whole thing finished. I was like, okay, I was just using the wrong thing. So remember that it's a good rule of thumb to follow. If you want these things to line up, then try Grid first. And then we'll talk about media queries again. Why don't we go back to CSS Grid here for a second, and let's do a quick demo in Visual Studio. And I'm going to use Blazor here. It's a little bit less important to the conversation at the present time, because you could do this in HTML, you can do it in JavaScript, you could do this type of stuff anywhere. It's just HTML and CSS. It's one of the reasons I love Blazor, is it is very dependent on browser standard technology. So this is all browser standard tech stuff. So imagine for a moment we have a set of items. These are going to be just divs in this case, but they could be any elements. And maybe we're pulling records out of database and looping over something here, but we want to display all of these things, and we want to put them in some different rows and columns in a nice grid layout. So let's go over, I'm running .NET 6 preview here. So we have the brand new live reload stuff that's really cool.
Nice.
And let's see, all I need to do is get a console. So let's open this in a terminal. And if we say .NET watch, it will run the application and it will hot reload any changes that we make. And this is what we have so far. So we have some gray elements that just kind of go vertically down the screen here. And we're going to start sprinkling in some CSS to make this into a grid. So I've got on the outermost element here, the wrapper or the container, however you want to phrase that, I have a class called main layout. And I'm using CSS isolation, which is a Blazor feature here. Essentially, it just takes and makes the CSS scope to the component. So these CSS styles belong to this index page component. First thing I'm going to do is just make my life easy with this grid, or this layout, and give it a height of 100 VH. So if you're not familiar with 100 VH, that means 100% of the view height. So I'm basically telling it to make this container as large as I have space for in the view height direction, the vertical direction. So I'm also going to add display grid to this container. And just that alone is going to make this, I forgot to save. Let's try that again. Let me save that and we go back. You can see already there is some change here. So the view height gave it the ability to stretch the entire length of the screen. And then being in a grid, just by default, each of these items will take up a grid cell. We haven't really defined what our grid looks like yet, but already we have some things happening by default. And there is a nice debugging tool now in all of the major browsers where you can click on this grid button over here in the HTML, and it will show you your CSS grid. And you can see it has created a single column and as many rows as it needs to display all of these items. I got that for free just by setting that to display grid and making sure it had the real estate to fill up the page. So just 2 lines of code so far, it's already looking a lot better. Now with CSS Grid, there is something called the grid gap. And what grid gap is going to do is give us space in between each of these items. And notice I added some margin as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's such a good name for it because I don't know how many times. Is it margin? Is it padding? I don't even know what it is anymore. Gap, so, I understand.
What's really nice about grid gap, which let me try something real quick. I was trying this yesterday. Yeah, grid gap is, or gap is also available. Gap is the newer syntax for this because it works in Flexbox as well. So you can use grid gap or gap. And what that is going to do, and what's really nice about it is if you use margin or padding, what's going to happen is you will get that margin or padding on every element, including the first and last. So if you set that, you might have some trailing white space at the bottom that you may not want. Gap will only go in between items where there is a gap between items. So
basically, they have done the work for us.
So if you still want that white space around the outside, just go ahead and set a margin to that container. And you can see that margin pop in, and we've got a full set of white space around all of those elements. So again, just a couple lines of CSS here, and everything's starting to look really nice. So let's actually define some columns now. And this is where things get a little bit more tricky. The syntax here is very modern in the way that is written. It's not like anything else that you've seen in CSS before as far as the measurements or the units go. If you're coming from a XAML world, this actually is pretty familiar, believe it or not. So in XAML, I'm trying to remember the syntax. I've got a blog post about it. But in HTML or CSS, we use fractions. So what we're telling the grid here is we're going to say, template some columns. Give me a column that is 3 fractions and a column that is 5 fractions. So this is going to divide up the real estate that is available into 2 columns and give me 3 fractions of it for one column and 5 fractions for another. So if these are even numbers, for example, if I say, here, let's do it live in the browser so you can see how this changes. So there's our 3 fraction by 5 fraction. You can see how they're, the first column is shorter because it's only 3, and then this one is 5. If we were to come over here and just say, give me 1 fraction by 1 fraction, those are equal numbers, so they're 50-50. So there's 2 even columns there. So you can use any numbers that you want here. And these are going to be a ratio of how that real estate is divided up. So 3 by 5 is the golden ratio. That's why I picked that. If you're not familiar with the golden ratio, I'd Google Bing it. It's if a designer kind of goal that you kind of aim for is this golden ratio. So this is that golden ratio. And again, you can just specify this however you'd like. We can make it 1 by 5, and this is going to be 5 times bigger than that first column. So it's very easy to shape these grids.
I really like this. Bootstrap has something similar, but they have divided their page in 12, I believe. Mm-hmm. So
you need to do math as well.
Exactly. So
yeah,
having this makes sense to me.
And especially if you have like images that are a certain width, you can use that number and just say, I want the other part to be 4 times larger than that.
Correct.
Much easier.
You can say, you can also say in here, there is, let's see if I can get this right. Max content is one of the values as well. So max content will make this column as big as the content. Notice it's stopping at the end of that letter right there. It's lined itself up just with the content there. So that one can be very handy as well. But for the most part, the fractions will help you. But there are really interesting things that you can do in that measurement space as well. And for those who haven't visited CSS in a while, there are even calculation functions. So you can do calc, and then you can do math inside of that calc function.
Nice.
So you can even do math in there if you need to for some reason. So we've got a column template set up. Now, here's something that's really interesting is we can have a repetitive template as well. So I want these dark gray boxes to be twice as large as the light gray boxes for the row template. So what I can do here is say grid, and when I say auto, this means that it's a template that's going to automatically repeat. So I'm going to say grid auto rows and say that auto rows is going to be 2 fractions by 1. So the first row is going to be twice as large as the second, but it will repeat after this pattern is finished. So if we go and save again and come back, notice that every other dark gray box is twice as large as the light gray box.
This is so handy.
And you can do that auto with the columns as well, but I find it handy on the rows.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes you repeat rows indefinitely. You get a data set, you bind it to something, and then you have this repeating pattern that you need to create. So that is how we can do those rows. Now, everything else that you see in here is mainly just to create a good display, these gray boxes and things, so we can visualize this. So there's not a whole lot in here that had to do with the demo, but there is something in here I do want to point out, because this is also like a major point of contention with folks when they talk about CSS. Notice that my text is centered inside of this box. Have you ever tried to center anything in CSS in your life?
Let's not talk about that.
It's usually very difficult, right?
Yeah.
This isn't hard anymore. This is a solved problem, and it's not solved by a framework. It's not solved by any kind of magic. There used to be a lot of CSS hacks to do it. The bad part is you Google it and you still get those old ways of doing it. So it's still, I still see people on Twitter ranting about not being able to center things in CSS. It is extremely easy. So in the example that I use just to make those boxes appear, I'm setting the boxes, individual boxes, to a Flexbox display. Again, the two display layouts are not mutually exclusive. We can use them together to make nice things. So we can say display flex, align the items to the center and justify the content to the center. And when you do that, it centers anything that is in that layout. I could do that with an entire page if I wanted to. I could set the either the first element or the body tag to this 3 lines of code, and it will center the element on the page to the center. And you can do this with any element at any container level. So just those 3 lines of code, this is how you center things now. As long as it is a Flexbox display, the only other caveat here is it may need some vertical space just to fill, but in general, all you need is these 3 CSS values, and you're good to go. It's going to center that thing. If it's an image, if it's an icon, no matter what, it's going to center it. You'll see me use it again here in just a minute. So that's the kind of tip of the iceberg for CSS Grid. There's a ton more we can do with it. We'll dive in just a little bit deeper here in just a second. Unless
Those
any of you
3
had questions
lines
about
is
this.
going to save me so much time.
Yeah, and swear words.
And swear words. And one thing that I really like when I do HTML is to use HTML as it was intended, to describe the content. And centering things, at least with the old style, you would need more than one div, for example, which wasn't part of the content, it was just part for centering the content. And with this, well, I don't need
it made
it
it
anymore.
so hard to read as well,
Yeah.
because which one is going with what, and all of a sudden you're nesting the nest. Yeah, this makes me want to scrap the Bootstrap from our blogs. Definitely. There's hope.
You can see in the tooling as I highlight these things too, it's got a nice, the tooling's come a long way. When I call a line item center, you see it pointing literally with arrows showing you this is what we're doing here. We're aligning the items with the center there, and then justifying any content in those items to be centered as well. So
I'm
I
way too
definitely like
excited
that.
about this.
You can see as I toggle those, that is proof that there's no other magic behind this. This is aligning those items in the browser for you.
What about browser support? Do all the browsers support this?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Which thing exactly? So we talked about CSS Grid, which is supported by all of the evergreen browsers. So anything like Edge, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. You can see like Opera Mini and Baidu are like the outliers in this one. I
know the guy that actually
IE11
runs
has some
Opera Mini,
support.
so
You do.
Flexbox as well. Justify. Same
at
here.
that.
It's about the same support there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then align items is going to be the same because it came with Flexbox.
Oh, it's even greener.
Yep. So
All
this
right.
is all
So, yes,
modern stuff that
supported
we
by
can
all.
use.
Perfect.
That's a great question. And a lot of these frameworks like Tailwind, they're just pointing towards the same thing in CSS. They've just created a wrapper around it. So you can use it in your HTML without having to go into CSS, which if you like very verbose CSS or HTML, then I guess that's okay with you. I like to keep,
Yeah, but I
if
think
you look,
you're
this has just one CSS class. That's it.
And I think you're onto something, because I had no idea this magic has come to CSS, because I've been stuck, well, it's my own fault, with Bootstrap. And when I set it up, I don't even want to go near it, so I don't look into it. And it didn't make me look at CSS one bit, which means I have missed all of this good stuff. So yeah,
So
it's easy to start with, easy to prototype, easy to do on your blog, but you won't learn anything and get the new magic stuff.
So let's look at another example, and let's use some Flexbox. So we talked about things that we wanted to align very specifically. We're going to look at some stuff that we want to be a little bit more lenient on the layout, but we're going to put this all together and make something cool at the end. We still got our watch running, so I just need to hit a different route here to be on that page. So we're going to stack some items up. What I want to do with these items is I want one, they're already all stacking kind of vertically here, but I want to make sure that I'm telling these exactly how I want them to lay out and where the items are going to flow. It's just going to be part of a weather display that I'm going to create. So I've got these two different items. I want one to stack vertically and one horizontally. So on the vertical, let's go over to the CSS and see how we can stack these items up vertically. Again, they're already kind of displaying top to bottom. It's just the natural flow layout of CSS, but of HTML. Let's go back and save these properly. Let's make sure this is applying. It is not. So this might be one of those cases where we need to tell live reload to start over. It's still in beta, so
yeah.
sometimes you need to give it a little nudge in the right direction. Okay, let's keep going. See if it picks it up here. So let's go ahead and display the other one horizontally, because that one was already somewhat vertical. And then let's go ahead and make this one horizontal. Make sure it builds out. And it is not refreshing. I had this issue yesterday. I think I had to close the browser down. And let's go ahead and cancel the application running as well. Run.net. Watch one more time. Let's see if this picks it back up where we want it to be. Yes.
It's kind of the new
There
Control-Alt-Delete, isn't it? Rebooting the browser.
Have you tried turning it off and on again?
So we turned it off and on again, and now it's picking up the styles. But you saw they were all kind of mangled up on the side. I added display flex and told this one I want to be in a column layout. And again, I'm using that align items to center again. And then on the horizontal layout, I'm also using a flex box, and I'm saying flex in the row direction. So if you're coming from XAML, these might be slightly different. It's flex direction vertical and flex direction horizontal, I think, for that. But in here we use row and column. And there's that gap again. So we can use gap that we learned earlier. And we're going to justify the content on this one to center. So this one we're aligning. Justify is when you're doing the content left to right. Align is when you're doing things top to bottom. So I don't know why we chose align and justify as the XY coordinates instead of just saying align X, align Y, whatever. But this is what we're doing. So just a little reminder, align is when you're doing things top to bottom, justify when you're left to right. And we're just going to center these items. And now we have these things centered. And this is Flexbox going in the column direction and Flexbox going in the row direction. What's really cool here, let's try to zoom in because they're kind of small looking in the, there we go. What's really cool is the features that they have added to the browsers to debug these. Let's try to get it on one of those items. Again, they have this little button that you can click. And the button is right here. It says Flex on it because we're using Flexbox. And you can see, probably kind of hard to see on the stream, but there's a rough dotted outline over each element. There's also some cool tooling down here in the style that is applied to that element. So if we click on this, check this out. We can toggle the flex direction
Nice.
live in the browser. We can control how it wraps. So if these were wrapping, we could control whether it wraps or not, and then what direction it wraps in, the alignment of those items, the justification, again, align and justify. It's not a lot because it's a vertical with 3 items. There's not a lot going on there, but you can see when we align the items, this is making a huge difference. So we can start the items at the end and align those to the right side. I think they chose start and end because not every language is left to right.
Yeah.
So that is a plus as well. They've kind of updated the syntax to be a little bit more understanding of what is it called? Not just languages, but globalization of your application. So I think that's part of it. So you can tell the Flexbox how to start these and end these, and justify the content, and you can even reverse their order, things like that. So it's all kind of supported here in this nice little toggle, so you can play around and see in real time what this is going to look like if you change some of the values. So that is pretty awesome. I like that.
That will
feature.
save some time.
This makes it very easy to debug things. So we'll do the same down here for a second and just take a look. This is our horizontal or row layout. And we can come in here and depending on what type of display you have, you may want to like baseline these things. These have a little bit of a padding around them so they're not going anywhere. But you can change it all here in real time. And I should add some wrapping to these demos so you can see how wrapping really can be changed. You can have them wrap also from left to right. There's a lot more settings than what's shown in that tooling as well. If you want some really good examples, CSS Tricks has some great material on both Grid and Flexbox. And you can buy some posters that you can hang in your office that have all of these graphics. So at a glance, you can see how these different properties work. But they have things like, the flex direction is pretty handy. But there is things like this where you can shrink and grow items. The wrapping that I was talking about, you can wrap it in reverse. So maybe you don't want it to start here. You want it to wrap this direction and go back that way. You can do that as well. There's all different sorts of ways to align this Flexbox. So you can even stretch. That can be super handy. So you can have all the items, make sure they're all the same height. And again, if you find yourself applying too many of these, check in the CSS Grid. Make sure you're not supposed to be using that instead.
But this feels like a perfect scenario for, like, let's say a menu system. So we have a couple of menu items on the top, and when you shrink down, you want them to be displayed vertically instead. Mm-hmm. Is that a good scenario to use this for example?
Absolutely. So I don't have the new version up here yet, but when I recreated my website with Flexbox, I have a grid that defines the layout of the page. So there is a grid that goes across the top of the menu here, and inside of that grid, there is a column that has a Flexbox that has the menu items in it. So when the page gets smaller, the items wrap in the in the menu nicely. This one's still using Bootstrap, but I've got the same functionality using Flexbox in the new one. So there's a combination of both the grid and Flexbox that will help do these type of menu layouts. And this could be a vertical menu as well. So if this was on the side here and all the items were, you know, in a column, that Flexbox would be a great choice again to lay those out. So let's take our little demo one more step. Let's hope the live reload stuff keeps up with me this time. So I've got this mess. This is a scenario you might run into where you're getting different elements added to your display, and maybe they're coming in a different order than what you're you want to order them in the display different than their order in the HTML. So here I've got some Blazor this time. So this is again a little more Blazor specific, but I have a weather component that shows the weather today. I have a component that shows the high and the low, and I have the weather symbol that all make up the weather display. So that's what we're looking at here. So I've got the high-low component, I've got the weather today component, and I've got the logo or the graphic for the weather today. And I want to rearrange this, but I don't want to go and rearrange my components. I want to just use some CSS to make these things lay out where I want them to go. And we could do that with CSS Grid. So let's go into the CSS for this and move some things around. So I've already got a good start here. I'm using display grid, and I'm letting it automatically lay this out. So I'm using one column, the first column is one fraction, the second column is two fractions. There's 3 items, so there's an odd number of items. That's problem number 1. So we have a grid which is a 2 by 2, so we have 4 squares and 3 items to occupy those 4 squares. And just by default, what it's doing is it's saying the first item is going to go here, the second item here, the third item here, and I don't have a 4th item, and if I did, it would go here. What I would like to do is take the second item and push it down here and make it take up both columns in that second row, and then move this one up here like that. We can do that through CSS. So let's take a look at the CSS again. So I'm using a deep selector here. This is a very specific thing to CSS isolation in Blazor. That's a debate for another show, whether you like CSS isolation or not. I actually don't, but I think it makes some easy code for demos, and people seem to like it. So I'm not going to push too hard against people using it. If they really enjoy it, good on them. But just letting you know that that's what that deep selector is for. It is saying put this selector in the global namespace. Otherwise, it won't hit that component because the CSS for this component is in the component. So if I take away that deep selector, it doesn't apply to anything. So we'll leave that on there.
That's a specific CSS command or
this is a specific thing for
CSS.
Blazor. Yeah. And I think Angular and React also use this syntax as well. So it's not too far lost on people that aren't Blazor developers. But I have a feeling our audience is pretty heavily skewed for that type of stuff. So I've added a couple lines here. And what I've got is my container has the grid. And I'm defining how those elements behave within that grid. So I'm going to tell this element, it is a grid column that starts at the starting point of the first column and spans 2 columns. So it's going to take 2 columns up, and it's going to start at the first column. So I only have 2 columns here, so that's going to give me all of the columns. The second one, we're going to start it at column 1 and span 1, and row 1 and span 1. So I'm actually telling the weather symbol to move its position to the first column and first row and only take up one cell. So if I go back, look at that. So I've moved my weather graphic here by just telling it where in the coordinates of that grid I want it to go. So if I click on this again, we inspect our weather symbol here. You can see I've got this syntax of 1/. So this is, I like that they added these. These are super helpful. So we can expand this. This is the shorthand syntax. So what it's doing is it's making it easier to write what we just expanded here. So I have, sorry, it keeps on zooming when I'm not asking it to. I have in the first property, grid column start. I'm saying start at 1. And then I'm having in the second property, span 1, which says grid column end span 1. I could write those explicitly as well, or I could use this little slash syntax. So if you look at the grid that I've highlighted, again, you click on this little grid button and it will highlight these grid cells for you. And I lost sight of this in here. Let's get that back. Come on, give me the right one. There we go. I want to have this all up when I zoom in here. You can actually see the numbers for the grid lines. So this is grid line 1. It's the start of the first column. This is the start of the second column. This is the third grid line. If there was any other elements, they'd start there. They do give you that third grid line, even though there's not another element for it. Because if you wanted to use start and end, you'd say start at 1, end at 3, and that would occupy both spaces. But I'm saying start at 1 and span 2. So, sorry, that's for this one. Start at 1 and span 2, so it goes across both of those. If I say start at 1, grid column 1 and row 1, that puts this element in the first box, and it will bump the next elements down the line. So I can move these about, which is really cool. So if I come up here and I were to say, give me 2, notice how I just swapped those 2 elements. 1, 2. If I were to screw up and say 3, it will create a grid column. So if you're ever troubleshooting and you're wondering why your grid has more columns than you defined, you screwed up somewhere down in the elements, and they are told to occupy a grid column that does not exist. Therefore, the browser creates one for you. I know that one from experience as well. It's happened to me many times. So this is a really handy feature. I think this is super cool because a lot of times as developers, we're handed things that we don't have control over. And this allows us to move those things around. You could also put these things in variables, believe it or not, and allow the user to move things about the UI. So that is another thing that we don't really have a lot of time to talk about here in the scope of what we're doing today, but you can literally put a CSS var inside of these and then let the user define what that variable is going to be somehow. So put a little toggle or something inside of your UI that lets them set or even drag and drop those items around. So there's a lot of creativity you can have. So let's see, how are we doing on time?
About half an hour left.
Awesome. So you can see these are kind of squishy layouts already. So they're not exactly fully responsive, but you can see that they're already automatically kind of shrinking and growing to the content because I'm using a lot of like the entire width of the page here and those fractional elements with the grid. They're fractional, so it doesn't matter how wide this is, it's going to take up those fractions. So we're already hitting a little bit on responsive web design. But I want to go back again to our original demo and show off some media queries. So let's go over to the index page again, where we have our div. It's on a main layout, and there are all of these items we get fed, and we're going to put those in 2 different columns. So we'll go back to that and take a look. And it's zoomed in pretty heavily here. I'm going to zoom back out because it can mess with some of the media query stuff. We've got our 2 columns. And if we shrink this down, we still have 2 columns. No matter how small we get this browser, it's going to be 2 columns. We could also do inspect and click this button up here to toggle the device on there and pick a device. So we could say, show me an iPhone 10. And this is a little cramped for an iPhone 10 display, in my opinion. So just to make sure it's refreshed and showing what it should, I would rather these be in a single column instead of 2 columns, but only on a small device like the iPhone 10. So what can we do with this? Well, we kind of were on the right track when we first started. Before we added the grid template columns to it, let's go ahead and take that back off for a minute. We'll take this row template off as well. Let's take a look at what it looks like now. Look, that looks a lot better, right? But if I go back to my desktop display, it is still just 1 column. That's not good. So what I like to tell people to do if they're doing responsive design and you're planning on having multiple devices supported is to start with the smallest device first.
Yes.
So we're good to go with the small device. We have a layout that works on the small device. So I'm going to take those template columns and rows and move those to only apply to anything larger than that small device. So if I say media minimum width is 768, these media queries are a little bit of a pain because to me they read as inverted logic. So this is not targeting a device with the minimum width of 768 pixels. This actually means it can have more than 768 pixels. So it's a little bit of a reverse logic in my opinion. And I think they're trying to correct this in the future specs of CSS. You should actually be able to use something like this, which would have been a heck of a lot better from the get-go.
Yeah.
But this is what we have now, so this is what I'm going to teach you. So when we are greater than 768, and I better correct that colon there, we are going to take the main layout class and add these 2 CSS values to it. So I'm going to save that and go back. There we go. We have our 2-column layout. And now if I shrink this down, notice right up here where the size is going up and down, as soon as I get over that threshold, it's going to snap back to 1 column. So now I have that full range of devices in there. So if I were to go back and show this on an iPhone, it looks good on an iPhone. If I go over to like an iPad Pro should be big enough to, it's a 1024, so it's got more than 768 pixels across. I can adjust my layout accordingly. And that is how all of those magical frameworks like Bootstrap and Tailwind work underneath the surface, is they have a slew of these media queries inside of them, and a lot of overrides for all of the different layouts that are built in. But you can create these very easily. I mean, that was literally 4 statements, and we've got a grid that applies to both mobile and desktop. Not everything's going to be this dead simple. This is just a boiled down example, but you get the idea of how this can be used here. Media queries are really, really powerful. There's some stuff that folks probably don't know exist in media queries, but you can get the user's preference for things like, do they want to see animation on your website?
Oh.
Are they using the light or dark theme on their operating system? Those are also media queries, and those can be really cool. So for
Yeah,
things like
definitely.
animation, if you have somebody that has vertigo and they get dizzy when they look at animations on a website, you might want to go ahead and turn those things off through CSS for them automatically by just detecting that their preferences are set to not show animations, and just go ahead in your CSS and override the duration for the animation, for example, can disable a lot of them. So you set the duration to 0 and it just doesn't animate. So that's like a kind of a kill switch for a lot of animations. But you have to enable that on your application. The other one is detecting the user's theme preferences. You get generally light, dark, or no preference. So if you detect dark, then you can go ahead and switch over to a dark theme or leave it the default of the light theme. So these are all things that you can do that are really neat with media queries as well. Mainly it's used for screen size. There's also some future stuff that's out there. One that I hope they all the browsers get on board with is one that's called data preferences. So imagine you're on a mobile device. Maybe you're in a place that has data caps, and you want to open up an application and not have it eat through all of your data.
Yeah.
You can actually have a media query that can do some different things with your application to make sure it doesn't do that. And I mentioned that one as a segue to the next part of this discussion, because we think of media queries mainly in the context of things that happen at runtime in the UI, but we can actually detect these things in the runtime through code as well. So one of the things we can do, did I stop my app from running? I think I may have closed it. Let's go ahead and make sure it's still up and running, but I'm not on the right, or I'm not up in the browser with it. So let's take this and open a new tab. So we have that media query in here, and we're detecting it through CSS. So it does, let's go back to responsive mode. So it can do the 1-column, 2-column thing. But if I were to go into, I'm going to say the J word. I'm sorry, I have to say the J word. I'm going to go into JavaScript for a minute. And I've just got the
I will
console
keep him
open.
calm during your this part.
Hold him back. Hold Jimmy back. I'm going to go into the console and say match media. This is an API for detecting media queries through JavaScript. It's called match media. And I can use something like, I was trying out, you can see where I was trying out the reduced data media query to see if it worked. It does not yet. But you can set, let's take the media query I've got here. I'm going to copy the parentheses as well. I think I need those. And we'll go ahead and put that in. And this, through JavaScript, will detect what media query is available. So I put in the same one we're using, and it came back as true, which is what I expected, because we have 2 columns. We know we're in a mode that we've matched that media query. It's greater than 768 pixels. And if I were to drop this down, make it 1 column again, let's rerun that line of JavaScript. It is now false. You can actually attach an event handler to this. So when it breaks over a threshold, it's triggering an event. That can be super handy for doing things in your app at runtime. But we're in Blazor. We're not doing JavaScript, right? So
Not if you ask Jimmy.
what can we do about this?
You had me at no JavaScript.
So let's open up. I'm going to go straight to the source repo for the tool that I'm talking about. and it is called Blazor size. This is something I wrote, just a little disclaimer, this is mine. And I've written a nice little abstraction around media queries at the runtime level. So it's not through CSS, but it is connecting to an event handler in JavaScript and providing you with a .NET event that you don't have to worry about JavaScript at all anymore. So I'm going to go over to my test project here where I have some pages and I have a fetch data example. Because you might be thinking, how is this useful to me in Blazor? So in Blazor, we have a component that is supplied through the Blazor size NuGet package. So you install the Blazor size NuGet package to your project, wire up some services and that type of thing. It's about 3 simple steps, and you have access to this media query component. Now you could say media query, and then you say the media the media value is that media query that you want. So a minute ago we put in this is our media query value. Min width is 768. In this library, you also have these helper methods, I guess you could say. They're constants that just provide some of the most common media queries that are out there. So this one has a less than media query. So if it's smaller than 767.98 pixels, basically the opposite of the media query we just had. It detects devices that are smaller than this size. So you say media, small and down, anything that's small or smaller than, and then we bind it to a Boolean value. So when that event triggers, it will toggle this value true false. Now in my code, I can have 2 different paths, and I could say if my screen size is small, then show weather cards with this data set. Otherwise, show a weather grid with the same data set. So I have 2 different components that are being displayed depending on the device size. So if I go run this one, and we are on the fetch data example, we have a nice weather data grid. We're on a desktop. We have plenty of real estate for it. That's great. When I go to a mobile device, whoops, it keeps wanting to snap on me. Now I have cards that look better on a mobile device. They go up and down, whereas the grid needs all of that left to right space. So this is being chosen at runtime by the application, how it wants to switch completely different components. Rather than trying to take the CSS and mold it to fit a grid in a flex layout, I'm actually just swapping out the entire component, which can utilize different behaviors for each device as well. So you could take this as far as you'd want to take it too. So not only can I control, say, the components I'm loading, but I could actually have a different branch in how I fetch the data or how much of it I fetch. I was talking a little bit about wishing I had that data media query right now. I don't have the data media query yet, but I could kind of mimic that a little bit. If I'm on a mobile device, I could assume that they don't want as much data. Maybe I'll dial it back to only fetch 5 records instead of 500 and let them lazy load in the rest of the records. Maybe use virtualization on a mobile device. Might not need it on a desktop. So you can tinker with that a little bit if you know what your users want or need. So this gives you a runtime approach to being responsive. This is known as adaptive rendering. So we're adapting the UI through code rather than just using some CSS and 100% width and height type of stuff. It's not just flexible anymore. It's actually adapting to do something completely different. I've done these where maybe there's charts and graphs that show on a desktop, and you can optionally load them in on a mobile device, so it's not as heavy. You're rendering all those SVGs and things. So you imagine you load this on the desktop, you get the full view, you load it on a mobile device, and you start scrolling. You see some buttons to load additional information. You press those, and you get the charts and the graphs, and make some extra API calls to get more data and things. So you kind of give the user the ability to load those things on demand if they want those. So you can be really creative with this. There's also some templates. If this wasn't easy enough for you, I added some templates as well. I think these are handy. They're probably a tad unnecessary, but I thought it was a nice have. You can define a media query with child content, and then you could say, if it's matched, I'm going to show this. If it is unmatched, I'm going to show that. It's basically doing that same if statement, but you don't have to bind it to a value and assign it and create the actual if statement. So you just kind of write this little template syntax, and it does the exact same thing.
Nice.
So that's you can see the example looks exactly the same in the browser. So you can have some fun with that one. Now, I do a lot of these projects as research for other things that happen in my professional life. So if you have Telerik UI for Blazor, you will notice there is a component called the media query component that looks an awful lot like Blazor size. It was inspired by, it's a different code base, but it is kind of derived from that idea. So you'll see very similar syntax and everything. And yeah, this kind of pioneered some stuff that we're doing with the Telerik stuff. So you'll see we have a Telerik media query. You give it the media query value, and then you have your event to deal with your data however you want to approach this, whether it's binding it to a true-false value or something else. Like I said, you can change how you load data and all that stuff. That is one of the newer components in the Telerik components. So if you're not using our stuff, I'm sorry. I wish you were. You can use Blazor size. It's free. If you are using our stuff, no need to get another library involved. It's already built into Telerik UI for Blazor, so don't go add it to your Telerik project. Just make sure you get the latest bits and it's in there.
Yeah. And we put the link in the chat as well, so people can find it. That's awesome.
So hopefully this cleared a lot up as to how you can build and adapt things with media queries. I've been using media queries for quite some time. I always have to look at the docs to write them correctly, so don't feel bad if you don't know them off the top of your head. Rarely do I ever write one successfully without looking at some documentation, just because the API is kind of clunky, but it's still a far cry from, and again, these are fine tools. I'm not trying to beat up your favorite things, but this is overkill for me. This is a bit of a turnoff. I don't need to write all this inline class stuff. You start throwing some logic in here with, Blazor, for example, you need to toggle something in the CSS class or add some event handlers and things or data binding. And these element declarations are going to start wrapping, 2 and 3 lines of code. And I think that's just overkill. Learn a little bit of CSS. It's what's driving this anyway. CSS has gotten a lot easier to read and write. And it will make you better at using the frameworks too. So it's not a loss of any kind. It'll make you better at writing Tailwind or Bootstrap. It's the approach I've used. I actually, I was not using. Yeah, I was using Foundation. I was using 960 GS. I moved to Foundation, and I started doing a lot of work with Foundation, and I was talking to some folks there. I got to be good friends with one of the people that helped create it, and that code base ended up becoming Bootstrap. And Foundation and Bootstrap both forked from the same repo at one point, long time ago. So my friend showed me, some of the internals of that, and was like, if you just know these things, you don't need the rest of the framework. Feel free to use it if you still want to use it. And I still used I still use Bootstrap for demos and things. It's great. But learning all of those internals makes you understand the framework better. So you're not searching for the right way to do things all the time. You're like, you know pretty concisely like what these things are doing under the hood, so you know which part of the tools to grab and use. It saves you a whole lot of time.
What is your experience when it comes to browser support? I mean, back in the day, you used jQuery. One of the upsides with using Bootstrap or Tailwind is probably that they have tested this on all the browsers. Is that a problem?
Unless you're trying to do something that's really bleeding edge, CSS Grid and Flexbox and media queries are stuff that has been around for quite a while now. I thought CSS Grid and Flexbox were new. They are not. They've been there quite some time. So I was kind of kicking myself for not using them earlier. All these times I've fired up Bootstrap and had to write row, column. I could have been using CSS Grid, and it's just so much easier, and it cuts down on all the noise inside of your HTML. And I've got some pretty complex layouts that I'm using with some of my Blazor applications now, and the latest is Blazport has been rewritten. I hope it's in a mode that it will actually execute and run, because I've been working with it on the live show for the last few weeks, and I keep breaking stuff. So this is all using Flexbox and CSS Grid, and it looks very similar to my personal website. So this is actually one of those instances where I've gotten the project is ahead of my personal website. using some of the same layout code base. So this is all using CSS Grid and Flexbox, and if I can get this out of my way, this header is actually fairly complex to do in CSS, but you'll see it combines some grid, CSS Grid here. And one of the things I was trying to do is divide this up in a very specific way. So you can see I divided it into just a bunch of cells, and there's several rows or several columns and 3 rows specifically, because I wanted this offset. And what's really nice here is I was able to leave the space empty and define where this actual menu was going to show up in the grid, and kind of leave that spot. So there's kind of that nice notch there. It gives it a cool little flair to the menu. And then the menu items themselves are a flex container. So if there were more of these, you would see that they flow left to right. And if the size of the browser gets short enough, they will just line straight up and down. So this site is using that. And I'm using centering here. Again, centering is so much easier with this stuff. So that stays centered no matter what size screen you're looking at. And then it's generally, a really good looking application in my opinion. So there's no Bootstrap here at all. And we've got some really nice looking visuals as well. But you can see the grids. You can see where I've used a grid in this top section, and it's spanning both rows, or both columns, I mean. And then we have some elements here. There's some instances where I'm moving these items around depending on what screen size you're at. So I'm using some of that, the ability to give, which cell do I want these items to display in? Because they may not appear in the same location in the markup as they do in here. There's also some Teleric media queries that were once Blazor size that are toggling these giant displays here because they're a little too much for a smaller screen. So I turn those off and just condense it down to a regular time limit. Some of the animations fall away as you get shorter. This is a little bit unnecessary when the planets are so close to begin with, or they're really small. It looks too noisy, so I took them out there. So there's a lot of responsive behaviors being taken into account here.
That's nice.
Remember
when we had to put like the 1x1 transparent pixels in cells
Yes.
to make them? Oh, you know what I'm saying.
Oh my gosh, yes. So I've got a long short story I'll make as short as possible about just that thing. So we had an app at my old job, and we had an argument with IT one day because the app magically stopped working. There were no upgrades on the app. This was a canned application that we bought, not one I created. It just stopped working. It was like, I have not updated this app. I haven't run any installers for it. It hasn't had any patches. There's no reason it should have stopped working. This is on UIT. This is your problem. And they're like, well, we didn't change anything. Like, we haven't changed any IP addresses. We haven't done XYZ. This is your problem, developers. I was like, oh boy, this is going to be fun. So meanwhile, the entire factory and organization is down because this is our financial system. And they can't report production numbers. They can't review any reports. Nothing is happening. People are going home for the day type of situation. And meanwhile, we're pointing fingers at each other. Well, probably about 4, maybe 6 hours go by, and I get a call from our networking folks, and they're like, yeah, about the issue, there was an antivirus update on the firewall. And that's all we know. Like, that's the only update we have. So I start digging around into log files, and I find that their antivirus software has blocked spacer.gif. And this is the sole reason that this application has failed completely, is it had no graceful way to fail out of a file missing. So it threw an exception and crashed.
Oh my gosh. And it didn't crash just a little bit. People went home.
Oh, it completely gave you a blank page with an error message that made no sense. And when we dug around in the logs after we knew there was something that wasn't our fault to look for, we found that spacer.gif was not found. And there was a 404 in the traffic. So apparently there was a virus that used a spacer GIF. So the company that ran the hardware for the firewall said, we'll just blacklist it. And then our firewall blacklisted it and crashed the entire. I would have never in a million years thought to look for that.
No.
All I knew is it wasn't my fault.
Ouch. Yeah.
So spacer GIF is or blank.gif, whatever they use these days. I hope they don't use it anymore. I've seen them. I've dealt with them. I've seen the worst of it, I think.
Been there, done that, had the t-shirt. We should totally add that to our store. Blank.gif or blank.jpg.
No, PNG, not JPEG.
It has to be a
then.
GIF or a JPEG 'cause it had to be transparent. Oh, that was so terrible.
Yeah. But now you don't have to have that issue anymore.
I guess
probably those things around still.
Yeah.
I guess to kind of close the loop here, I don't want to kind of pat my own back on the Blazport. I think it looks pretty good. It's I'm not a designer. I dabble a little. I think it looks good enough. Let's just say that. So while you can do this with Tailwind and it looks fantastic, and your mileage may vary as ease of use, you can build really great looking things with just regular CSS as well, if you just know where to focus your energy. And it's really not as hard as one might think. If you're going to learn all the things to do this in Tailwind, you can learn all the things to do it in CSS as well. It's again, they've mapped pretty much the values from CSS to HTML, which I think is absolutely bonkers. But you know, those things shouldn't translate too hard. One of the things that's really interesting about this as well is this overlay that they use. I'm probably getting off on a little bit of a tangent here, but this is something that has irked me before. Doing these overlay things is kind of obnoxious in CSS. And the approach that they took in the Tailwind exam just in the past before. And what they, if I could, well, I won't go down the road of trying version so I could see this. They've taken, and these two elements actually exist beneath each other. So this one is actually down here in this space. And they set a negative margin on it.
No.
And when you have a negative margin, it pulls it up and it will overlap the elements above it.
Interesting.
This is fine, except it shoves your whatever's down here, it offsets it. So anything that exists below that negative margin then gets pulled up as well. So you're always fighting this battle over subtracting stuff from everything that followed these negative margins. It gets really annoying after a while. And how I know this is because that's how this was originally done. This little stupid thing here would always pull the entire page up by 30 pixels or whatever it is. With CSS Grid, you can actually have grid items occupy the same space and overlap each other.
Nice.
So you can do those things in CSS Grid, which for some reason they chose not to do in that example I just showed. They still use the negative margin thing, probably just because it's worked in the past. They just used it again. But if this was a grid, you could actually set a grid. You could set a divider up in the grid and move this element into that grid location, kind of like we did with the sun in the weather example. You can overlap things as well. They can occupy the same space. So that's pretty interesting too.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of cool.
And I've got so many ideas for continuing on rewriting our page.
So you're doing the CSS?
No, I'm not doing the CSS.
You saw it's easy.
Well, we need to talk afterwards, Ed, because apparently I need to learn CSS.
So one thing I may not have mentioned as well is grids can be within grids as well. So you'll see there's grids upon grids in this. So there's no reason that you can't overlap grids too.
So how do you still have the gray alternating page up?
I don't, but I can run it really quick. Let's see. Start this one.
Because I have a question.
Absolutely. That's what I'm here for. Oh, shoot. Oh, good. I thought I closed my browser that had StreamYard in. I've done that before. All right. So what was the question? I have the
the question is when you run it in a browser, let's say, you get the every other row is dark.
Okay.
But when you run it on a phone, you get 2 light gray and 2 dark gray.
Yeah.
So how would you go about to fix that? Would you do it the Blazor route, or can you do that in CSS as well?
You could do that in CSS. So the way I'm controlling that light and dark element is through a CSS selector that uses an Nth Child Selector. So what I would do is have I'd put this inside the media query. Let's move that first. So this is actually the code that highlights those elements. So it uses the nth child. So it's saying every time there is a fourth child minus one. I can't remember why I had to write it this way, but it has to do with it. There's two elements, then two elements.
Right.
It's not exactly every other element. It's every other two elements. So
Yeah.
it was kind of a tricky nth child selector, but we'll put that in here, and this will make it not in live reload mode. So I may have to refresh that. Let's put it in live reload so it'll play nicely. So to live reload this, we have to go through the command line. This is the current state of it. This is .NET Watch is the best way to get this working. And there we go. And there we go. All right. And why is it not picking up? They should all be, let's try to move this up a bit. Just to make sure this is the first thing it sees. There we go. Now it's working.
There we go.
So now they're all light gray. And if I did this, now they're alternating. So through the media query, I could change those. And if we wanted to do every other one, we would just have to supply an nth child query
Right.
that behaves the way we want it to on that screen size. So we'd put that outside of the media query. And this one, the nth child is going to be different. I think you could do, since now they're not groups of two, it would be...
I'm putting you
There's
on the spot here.
Yeah, I've got to search this one. There's an even odd that you can do.
Oh.
So this is basically how you do CSS. You Google it.
Yeah.
I know how to
there's-
Google.
We can still use nth child, but there's something more shorthand, I think, if I remember correctly. See, this is how you do even and odd. But I thought they baked in one that was literally, there it is. Yep. There it is. Which I couldn't use this because they were groups of two.
Yeah, of course.
So you could do that. And then I think you only need one of them. This was doing the first and the second item. So you would do something like that, and then look at that.
There we
There
go.
you go.
Oh, but it affected that one. I got to reset.
Well-
You got to reset it.
Yeah, at least we know it's doable. Awesome.
What I'd probably do here is put another media query that targets less than.
Yeah, that makes
something
sense.
like, which this one has to have like a decimal in it, which is weird. Like writing these from scratch again is never an easy part of this. But basically, is you have the opposite of this media query in here. It'd probably be the easier way to handle this. It'd be 0.798, I think, like that. The reason it's like this is if you make it 768, you get like a weird overlap of where the two are still valid, and weird things can happen. And that's not working now. Oops. But
Shouldn't
get
it
the-
be max
get
width?
the oh yeah, that's what it is. Thanks, Jimmy. I knew I did something wrong. Like I said, they never go right the first time. But this should isolate them a little bit to where they don't
There we go.
conflict with each other. There.
Look at that. Nice.
And then we might be able to do one more fun one here and say, let's try something real fast. Let's say media. Let me go to some documentation again.
Again, Google.
There it is. First color scheme. This is one that I always find so fascinating. Let's take this, and we need the right values here too. There it is. That's the whole media query I want. So you could say prefers.
So this is the one you want to
Dark.
put in.
If we prefer a dark color scheme, say body, background, it's black.
And also, please, people, if you do this, do it the whole way. I have so many apps. I put my phone on dark mode, and there's so many apps that just change the background and do not check the actual font color.
Yeah.
So I get black text on black background. Does not work.
I'm getting something overriding it. I don't know if it is, or it's not being applied for some reason. I know my theme is set to dark. Not getting it triggering. So a little bit of a live demo fail. I know this does work though. I'm just not writing it right or something. There's prefers color scheme dark and light. We'll try, let's try, I don't know why that's not happening right now.
Do you have preferred
be the right
dark
one.
in the browser as well? It
Yeah.
looks like you have that.
Yeah. So I know it works. I just don't know why it's not working here. I don't know if it's the live reload thing again or what it's doing, but normally that does the trick.
Something is stealing your thunder.
So if we want to really have some fun too, they don't always have to be in CSS as well. What some people don't know is you can actually go and create a light and dark CSS link. So you can say link rel equals style sheet. And I don't have these files, but I'm just going to show you what it would look like. You can say href equals light CSS media prefers light or prefers theme, whatever the media query is. There it is. You can actually inline it right here. You could say that. And I think it's
That's cool.
light, and it will load
This is what
that.
we're gonna do.
Yeah.
It will load that file, and then you just have another one that does the opposite. The only downside to this approach is that, first of all, it will load both resources, but the real downfall here is this doesn't give the user an option to set it per application. So
Right.
if they are running a dark operating system, but they go to your app and for some reason they don't like the dark theme, they can't change it.
That's
The
a
other
good
way
point.
around, even in the CSS, you can't really do anything there. But when you go and use something like Blazor size, you can offer a way to toggle it.
Yeah.
So I'd probably use Blazor size to detect it, and then use Blazor to change the link in the head of the
Yeah.
document.
Yeah, I think that's better because, like you say, even if you prefer dark theme when you do whatever, maybe you're a gamer or you're on Twitch all the time and you really want to see the media on dark background, but when you go and read something, maybe you prefer the light background.
Crazy talk.
I wish they had more information here as well, but in reality, they don't. So they give you light, they give you dark, and not set. So what you want to do is figure out what your default is. Generally, I default to light. So if it is light or not set, then you give them the light theme, and
Yeah.
then if you just toggle the dark if you don't get one of those other two. That way, if the if it's not supported by the operating system is generally what the third value is for, it will toggle back to light theme by default. Which
Yeah, that
you
sounds reasonable.
should be coming up in, like if I do this, so we open up, I don't know why that other demo isn't working right now because I've done it a million
It
times.
bugs you, doesn't it?
But if we go into the console and we were to ask JavaScript, what, in the wrong one, there we go. If we said match media and we throw in prefers color scheme, it says false here.
Yeah.
And then if we were to say, do we want a dark theme? It says true.
True.
So why that wasn't working in our app, I don't know. JavaScript understands that they're on a dark theme. CSS, on the other hand, is giving us a little trouble here. I think it's something to do with hot reload, not refreshing the CSS properly or something. But yeah, you could toggle the theme of the application. If you want to take like a really like shortcutty route to doing all of that, what you can do if you're using Bootstrap. Again, I don't have anything against Bootstrap. I think it's called Boot Swatch.
Yeah.
And if you want to just do like a quick example of it, you just grab like the Darkly theme.
Yeah.
And load that one, and then use the regular one or use one of like the flat one or something for the light theme, and just toggle those two, and that'll instantly give you the light and dark theme for your application.
Fair warning about that site, though. You will be stuck for hours.
Oh.
Or is it just me? Maybe there's just another one that's a little bit better. This is good, but maybe there's another one.
Got a glass one. Yeah.
Yeah. You can get stuck for hours, I tell you.
The idea here is you can grab a light one and a dark one that look very similar and swap those two with that trick I showed you with the link.
Yeah.
The media query in the link. So you just target the media attribute there. Or you can use, oh, come on, themebuilder.telerik.com. And oh boy, look at all those products. UI for Blazor, you can say start theming. You know, depending on what you like, you know, you can grab like maybe the material theme, and then you go ahead and create your theme. You grab the light theme, and you come over here and say theme, luminosity, dark, and then you download that one, and you have the light and dark themes there, and then you just apply either of those to your app. So you can very quickly create a light and dark theme through either of those methods. If you're using the Telerik components, you've got a mapping to a dark theme right here in Theme Builder. And then we have some additional light dark themes here too. So this is cool because we have Sky Light and Sky Dark. And I think it's, there it goes. So it gives you a little bit different UI colors. I like that. I actually like that. Nice. It's got some cool like blue pastels and stuff in there that are really neat. So you can do that, and then you can switch over to Sky Light, and it should be a light theme with those same like blue pastel looking colors. It's really cool. So then you hit download on both of those, and then swap them with a media query, and you've got support for light and dark themes in your app.
That is cool.
Has nothing to do with, very little to do with responsive web design, but I thought I'd share that fun tidbit.
But it's still very nice to give the user the option.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So we're responsive to the, or we're adapting to the user's preferences. So still a little bit adaptive.
Demo of this in the demos on demos.telerik.com. If you go to the Blazing Coffee Warehouse app, you'll see this is a dark themed application, and we have the ability to auto detect that theme, or we can choose a light theme. So there's an implementation of that.
That's nice.
Yeah, so it's picking up the dark theme from my system.
That's cool.
It's really cool
Yeah, we
stuff.
need to figure out what we are doing on our page I think in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. I've learned
A ton.
a ton.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Me too. And also enjoy the rest of your vacation.
Thank you. This was a nice little break from it. I got to
You need a
talk
break
tech
from
for a
your
little
vacation?
bit. Yeah.
Oh
you
yeah,
start-
we sympathize.
You start wondering, like, am I forgetting anything? Am I missing out on anything? I feel like I've been unplugged for too long. Even though I'm like wearing a VR headset, playing games with kids most of the time, like electronics haven't left my life, but I haven't been checking Twitter and work emails very often and all that stuff. I checked my work.
It probably
I checked
is.
my email like Tuesday, and then I had this message like, "You're supposed to be on our show on Thursday." I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm totally meant to be put together for that."
And you
I
probably
totally didn't
missed like
forget.
10 new. You forgot us?
Of course not.
No, you didn't. Or did he? Well, again, thank you so much. It was really educational.
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
Thanks.
And next week we are back with Dan Roth.
We are.
So even more Blazor stuff or .NET 6 and stuff like that.
Yeah. Awesome.
So see you then.
Bye.